So, hello everyone. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. We are very honored to have with us today Dr. Alicia Wanless. She is the director of the Information Environment Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which aims to foster evidence-based policymaking. As part of her work at Carnegie, Alicia created a multi-stakeholder network in partnership with the G7 Rapid Response Network to support information integrity efforts in Ukraine. Alicia was a technical advisor to Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder and is a founding member of its global cybersecurity group. At King's College London in War Studies, she completed her PhD combining strategic theory and ecology in a new approach to understanding conflict within the information environment. Thank you, Alicia, for being with us today. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. I'm just going to move that from your camera. Oh, cool. So that actually saved me some things that I thought I had put in, but I don't need to. So I'm glad to be here. I think the first thing I would say is, yes, I work for an American organization, but I am Canadian. Beyond that, a few things about who I am that wasn't in there. I'm a pracademic, meaning I have one foot in academia and the other in practice. My undergraduate degree was actually in Russian, and I've been pretty obsessed with war and propaganda for as long as I can remember, which will explain some of my more than crazy slides because I steal a lot from propaganda posters. I also recently started playing around with Gemini to make those images seem a little bit more alive. And I've chosen to leave them in the deck with all of the errors and badness that they create because I think it's hilarious and this talk is long and you will need some humor. And then the last thing, which you already know, I did my PhD in war studies at King's College London, and I'm drawing on that for this talk and for the book. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is ask you guys some questions. So put your hands up. Does anyone here feel like politics is more polarized? Okay. Does anybody here know somebody who thinks the media is completely biased? Is there anybody in your life whose reality seems to be completely at odds with yours? Maybe over vaccines or overreach in the government? Right. So welcome to the throes of an information competition. Some of us may be actively participating in it, but all of us are experiencing it. The information competition I'm talking about has been escalating and playing out across many democracies. The information in each in their own way. The most evident example of this is in the United States, but it's also happening here. The information competition we're experiencing today has been building for decades. On one hand is a conservative worldview that believes that media, education, and other bureaucracies have been co-opted by progressive ideas, and in trying to reclaim those institutions is actively undermining them. On the other side is a progressive worldview, fighting on behalf of various groups for social rights, and it tends to focus on the discriminatory nature of those same institutions, which also erodes some faith in them as well. Both sides try to inform policy. Both sides have taken an active interest in content in things like public libraries. The competition between them is playing out online as well, especially over how digital platforms should moderate content. And viewed from either side, both can be seen as having attempts to censor or control information. Now, competition unto itself can be a good thing, but when two sides can no longer come to a constructive shared conclusion in the longer term interests of society, especially if they start to break down into open animosity, this becomes a challenge for democracy. Now, what I hope to share with you today is a way of understanding how these information competitions come to be and how taking an ecological perspective on them might eventually reveal keys to unlocking how they could be de-escalated. Now, throughout this talk, I will be using a lot of terms that might be new to you. All of them come from my book, so if I'm not overly clear, you can read the things in there, and hopefully it will be a bit clearer. An information competition is when two or more communities compete to have their worldviews adopted by the wider public. Now, to do this, they use all the available tools to produce outputs, to flood their information ecosystem with narratives to try to win hearts and minds of the wider public. As the competition escalates, these worldviews tend to become increasingly incompatible with each other, making it really difficult for both to coexist at the same time in the same information ecosystem. What I mean by that, to take an example, is that in the US before the Civil War, it's really hard for a concept like abolition and slavery to coexist in the same system. The phenomenon is nothing new. Information competitions have been around since the dawn of history, as have information ecosystems, which is another key term. Information ecosystems develop over time. The ones we have today are not separate or completely different from everything that came before. Information ecosystems have existed since people learned how to communicate. It began with gestures. People developed language, which is a tool that they could speak, which is an output, to share ideas. And from there, every new tool, like the alphabet, led to more outputs like letters, with each innovation adding more complexity to the information ecosystem where they were introduced. All the way up to today, where so much of our communications are dependent on the internet and the complex digital system that underpins it. Not to mention electricity, which is often forgotten in a lot of this. Things like language and writing haven't disappeared. They remain the basis for how we communicate today. However, the more a society relies upon digital technology to produce, share, and importantly, store most of its outputs, the more inherently fragile that information ecosystem becomes. And while each layer of technology introduces additional vulnerabilities, these tools themselves do not exist in a void. At best, they're like a connective tissue between us. If humans don't know how to use them, these tools ultimately become meaningless. While human ability to use those tools is based on learning, which is derived mostly from outputs that are produced using those tools, a functioning ecosystem is complex and dynamic, more akin to many overlapping feedback loops than the typical definitions of the information environment listing parts conveys. So the more people, the more tools, the more outputs, the greater the complexity and thus fragility of an information ecosystem. And that's where we are sitting today. Information ecosystems also come in many forms. They can be virtual, forming between scholars sharing ideas through letters that spawned the Renaissance. They can be closed and controlled like Sparta, producing few tangible outputs, such that the idea of them being austere and good at fighting is pretty much all that they left behind. Or they can be big and sprawling and diverse, like Ukraine, framed by laws and geography. But virtual, big or small, every information ecosystem consists of people, tools, and outputs, connected through interrelationships and bound by an idea, making them very dynamic. So in this way, information ecosystems, they emerge. There's something that forms, and they're dynamic and they change. Now, all information ecosystems exist within a global environment. The information ecosystem we're in right now, Quebec, doesn't exist in isolation. No information ecosystem does. For better or worse, it is situated in the wider Canadian information ecosystem and beside that of the United States and connected beyond that to other Francophone ecosystems. And the people who are part of this information ecosystem are also part of other information ecosystems. In fact, some of you might even be talking to other people through devices right now who are situated in other ecosystems. In a globalized world with so much traffic, both physical and digital, moving between countries, national information ecosystems are shaped not only by domestic conditions, such as economics, education, politics, climate, and health, but they're also shaped by conditions in other countries. Diasporas shape their new home, but they're also still linked to their place of origin. Because information ecosystems are dynamic, they're also constantly changing. Populations fluctuate, skills for processing information shift. Resources shape what tools develop, which in turn shapes what outputs are available, but patterns can be identified in these shifts. So I explored 5 historic information ecosystems to lay the groundwork. It's just the beginning for a theory of information ecology, which I'll come back to in a bit. That exploration started with ancient Greece and went all the way up to Ukraine around 2014. In all these cases, patterns emerged that related to innovation and changing demographics, political participation, economics, and several others. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to draw on one of those examples because it's one I keep coming back to, especially when I think about the US. If you don't know this man, please allow me to introduce King Charles. He's the OG King Charles. The first King Charles of England only became regent because the heir apparent died. His brother died, leaving him in line. He was sickly and he stuttered, and his father abused him. As the king, Charles was thin-skinned. He was tempestuous. He surrounded himself with his favorites, going so far as to forbid the traditional aristocracy from even living in London. He sent them back to their estates, which cut him off from a key feedback loop between the ruler and the governed. Charles lusted after absolute power. He desperately wanted to basically be an autocratic monarch, like some others in Europe at the time. In fact, he saw this as his divine right. With a personality like that, it's not overly surprising that he had a bad relationship with Parliament. And when Parliament wouldn't bend to his whims, well, he just prorogued it for more than a decade. Now, the problem with this is, and there were many, was that Charles needed Parliament to raise funds for the government. Taxing people without the Parliament was illegal, sort of like imposing tariffs without Congress. So he turned to a medieval loophole in ship money. Under certain circumstances, a sovereign was able to levy coastal populations to build a navy. But it couldn't be done during peacetime. It couldn't be put onto non-coastal populations, and it was very rarely used. That didn't stop him. In 1634, Charles desperately needed to raise funds for his secret treaty with the King of Spain to help Spain fight against the Dutch Protestants. Now, if you know anything about this period in history, this is not something that's going to go down very well in England. You see, England's newfound version of Protestantism was on shaky ground. There were people among them who were very extreme fundamentalists who felt the Reformation didn't go far enough. They were disparagingly called the godly, and they would have been very pissed off, in other words, to find out that the Protestant king was colluding with a Catholic king to suppress other Protestants. And they had living proof in memory. So one of the things that they were really obsessed with was that there was a global conspiracy to bring England back to the papacy. And this was led by the Pope, which they believed was the literal Antichrist at the time. They had evidence in recent times in 1605 with the Gunpowder Rebellion that tried to bring down Charles's father, James, and in the distant memory of 1588, the Spanish Armada. Now, they were putting this actively in Bibles. This is 100 years later in the 1700s, and they still have the Gunpowder Plot, the Spanish Armada in an English Bible. They were quite obsessed with it. So needless to say, supporting a Catholic king against Dutch Protestants would not have been popular. So Charles turned to ship money and granting monopolies. It also still sounds very familiar to me. With no public war to justify the tax, Charles made up a reason. He claimed that commerce was endangered by pirates, and besides that, there was general unrest in Europe that posed a threat with the 30 Years' War raging between, you can probably guess, the Protestants and the Catholics. Protestants that were also involving Charles's own sister. So this is a war that's starting to spill over. Now, it would be really convenient to blame the civil war that follows in 1642 on Charles's poor decision-making. And of that, there are endless examples. But the English information ecosystem had also been going through a number of changes at the time. I'm repeating myself a lot. There are many of these changes that we'll see from my case studies, but also that should be familiar today. If the personality problems, the lies about tariffs and poor choices weren't enough. So the first shift comes in innovations, and I need to stress that this is plural. These innovations change how information is processed and distributed. In this case, that change was the printing press, but it also depended on an earlier innovation in paper, which was remarkably slow to develop in England. This then increased the volume and speed at which information can be processed. New outputs came into the ecosystem, things like pamphlets, the first newspapers and Corantos, but letter writing was still really important and a key form of how news would travel throughout England. Along these shifts, other innovations like a new postal system that came out in 1635 and an earlier development with canals helped move that information through the English ecosystem faster. The second change was in people. There were more people who were able to engage in the public sphere than before. In part, this was a matter of demographics. Remarkably, the English population just rebounds to pre-plague levels around the time of Charles's reign. It takes a long time for them to get back. So now you actually have more people numerically. But in greater part, it's due to a mass increase in literacy. Because of the Reformation, there is a belief that a person has to read the Bible to be a good Protestant. This increases the level of literacy, particularly with a specific group of people in apprentices. So young men are now able to read more than before. And they become a target not just of printers to consume, but also of politicians to agitate. What's more, these young men have to remain single until the age of 24 when they can actually become a full-fledged master. So you have a lot of involuntarily celibate young men. The third shift is that new ideas emerge that challenge existing ones, which sparks the information competition. In this case, the parliamentarians, among whose ranks included a growing merchant class who had been enriched through new colonies, as well as the godly that I mentioned before. They were both very frustrated by Charles, and they began to demand increasing authority in the parliament. They appealed to the public through printed pamphlets and by leading the apprentices both in petitioning and rioting and protesting. Now, Charles did what most leaders would do. He felt threatened. He tried to control his information ecosystem. He banned all rumors and slander about him and the Queen. Oops, sorry. I really screwed that up. In one famous episode, there was a book that was critiquing theatrical plays, and he was questioning the morals of it. This landed him in trouble because it could be viewed that he was criticizing the Queen. So his books were burnt publicly by the chief executioner, and he had his ears cut off. Now, despite controlling the number of printing presses in the country and the volume of editions that could be printed on them, Charles really couldn't stem the flow of propaganda from abroad or domestic politicians from using such content for their own gain. European Protestants, they secretly landed apocalyptic propaganda in England to provoke their brethren into supporting them in the 30 Years' War. But the more zealous Scots, seen here rioting in a church, were unhappy with Charles for their own reason. He was also their monarch because of his father, and they flooded the English market with pamphlets provoking the godly brethren. The printers, for their part, well, let's talk about the original business model problem. As Ethan Howard Shagan tells us, most printers were driven by profits, not always motivated by politics and religion, and publishing sensationalist material and content, espousing both sides. So sometimes you'd have a printer who would be putting the information out for the godly as well as the king, because this led to greater revenues. That's pretty much all they were after. As Jode Raymond outlines in an excellent book on the topic, these pamphlets emerged quickly and in greater quantity, and in many ways, they were reminiscent of social media today, reacting to whatever was published. So like these ones on the screen, they would come out based on specific events, or they would actually engage in a dialogue. So it was slower, but at the time would have felt a lot like social media does today. The content in these pamphlets they published was often of questionable content, contributing to information pollution. Some were pure entertainment, telling tales of human deformity and other monstrosities. Information pollution is the presence of low quality information, and it includes a lot of different types of things that degrade the information environment. So higher quality information, if we borrow from data science, would be accurate, complete, timely, unique, and coherent. On the other end of the spectrum, well, is crap like this. Pamphlets on monstrosities, spam, email, all the way up to outright lies and abuse. Often this pollution comes along with information floods. These occur when there is a marked increase in a particular output. The increase in output can be caused deliberately by an entity who wants to shape the information environment. It also just happens naturally when you have a new tool that increases a type of output. So for example, the English book market boomed around 1640 because they had some decrease in regulation. That meant to a doubling year after year in the 3 years, up to 4,000 books, which was crazy because they started out with about 848. That would have felt like a lot to a person then. And indeed, there are complaints about having too many books to read that tire the eyes. Another example of an information flood was a spike in anti-Catholic pamphlets that were sharing popish plots. These conspiracy theories were coming out all the time. Dozens of Catholic conspiracies were covered in the press in late 1641 and early 1642. One example, John Brown testified at the House of Commons in 1641 that there was a popish plot involving the Jesuits, courtiers, the Archbishop, and Catholic immigrants from England. So basically everybody could possibly be part of this conspiracy. In another one, there was just a French fleet sailing by that raised a panic where people came to believe that the Queen was going to overthrow the king with financing from the Pope. And this was getting a lot of time. This was taken seriously in Parliament. While the printing press created the conditions for this new type of flood, information flood, consisting of mass printed material, they also tended to occur in response to events. So like the introduction of the Common Prayer Book in Scotland, which was why the Scots were rioting in that other slide, the dissolution of the Short Parliament, and the Irish Rebellion, to name a few. So just like today, scandals, plots, and impending doom attracted readership in an information ecosystem where instability and concerns for the future were clearly present. It was a mess, to say the least, not entirely dissimilar to the US or even Canada a little bit today. Many democracies have been experiencing similar changes in their information ecosystems to what I found across those case studies. So the first one is that our information ecosystems have had innovations added that change how information is processed and distributed. This has increased the volume and speed at which information is shared. You've all experienced it. It started with cable TV ushering in a 24/7 news cycle in the 90s, followed by the internet, social media, and now AI. These innovations have come at a much more rapid succession than they did with writing, print, or the telegraph, and even radio. So we're experiencing a lot more fast. The business model of the tech companies is still an issue. Obviously, it's well covered, but there are similar concerns could be raised about many media and entertainment companies. A key difference between Charles's time and today in a place like Canada, however, is that it isn't just the information flowing into our ecosystem. The very tools we depend upon to access and consume that information are also controlled by interests elsewhere. At the same time, local news media is dying or being consolidated, and the rate of information floods and pollution we experience are obviously far greater thanks to these innovations. The second thing is, as a result of digital technology, more people are engaging in the public sphere than before, mostly by posting on social media. In some countries more than others, I worry that adult skill levels have not kept pace for this engagement to be meaningful in the context of democracy. For example, in the US, the National Institute on Literacy said that as of 2022, 21% of adults were illiterate, and 54% only had a grade 6 level of literacy in the US. And before we get too smug, 19% of Canadians scored the lowest on literacy on the literacy test with the OECD. The UK's stats are worrying as well. And if that sounds small to you, in a first past the post system, it only takes about 30% sometimes to win a government. This is all happening as demographics shift in many countries. Global migration continues to increase, even with Trump's mass deportations. The last stat, I think from Pew about a month ago, put the total percentage of immigrants at 15% in the US. In Canada, it's 23%. That's the highest since Confederation. And the UK has also had peak migration in 2022. So all of our diversity is increasing, which I would argue is a good thing. At the same time, global economic uncertainty will likely exacerbate society's ability to cope with all of these changes. In countries like the US, Canada, and the UK with high or growing wealth gaps between rich and poor, I'm very concerned that the conditions are highly exploitable for populist politicians of various stripes. For example, Canadians experiencing financial hardship are more likely to have lower trust in public institutions. 81% of Canadians experiencing financial hardship have lower rates of trust in public institutions, compared to 61% of those who aren't experiencing the hardships. Over 2/3 of them also have low levels of trust in news or information they receive from the media. Moreover, we're already experiencing an information competition, which comes as no surprise to me, considering changing circumstances with many national information ecosystems. Changing ideas about human rights have clearly challenged conservative perspectives, sparking an information competition that's playing out internationally. Now, I know That was a lot of information to throw at you all at once, and therein lies the challenge. Problems arising within the information environment do not happen in a void. While new technologies can certainly be disruptive, we need to understand the system where they're introduced to really know how they impact society. I think we can get there by assessing factors related to core elements of the information ecosystem, so people, tools, and outputs, and the conditions affecting them, like economics and politics, to get to that bigger picture. This involves answering 3 questions. I know, it's just 3 simple questions. Who are the people in an information ecosystem? How do they see themselves? What communities do they form around what identities, around what languages, where? What's their capacity for assessing information? Do they understand risk? Have their literacy levels changed? What changes in their ecosystem may be impacting their decision? Has there been a change in economic or demographic circumstances? What types of informational outputs are available and consumed by these communities? Are their informational needs met based on what we're expecting from them, maybe as informed voters? Who controls those outputs? How might that be shaping the ecosystem? And finally, how are those outputs produced, shared, consumed, and stored? What tools and services are involved, and who controls them, and how does that impact the types of outputs communities have access to? This might seem complex, but there's a model for studying complex and dynamic systems in physical ecology. It's not only that there are lessons to be had in the methods that ecology uses. I think there's also lessons in terms of how that field developed. Are you guys familiar with ecology? Is anybody a secret ecologist here? I wasn't either, I admit. So ecology is the study of the relationships between living organisms, including us, and their physical environment. It's a field that structures work from and combines many disciplines to form an understanding of the physical environment. They build on fields like botany, zoology, ecosystem analysis, to name a few. Ecology follows an hierarchy that organizes life from the smallest to the largest level, starting with individual organisms and progressing to populations, community, ecosystems. And David and I will have a great paper sometime in the near future that borrows on that. But before the field of ecology developed, scientists saw the environment as mechanistic, animals as machines, and humans as separate from the natural world. In normal circumstances, this guy quacks, because that's what AI does. It adds sounds to everything. Scientists studied parts of the environment, like plants and animals, separately from the system where they existed. That all changed when this guy came along. This is the Prussian naturalist Alexander von Humboldt. He set out for South America in 1799, and he ultimately puts forward a way of understanding physical ecosystems as a delicate web of life. He saw that human clearing of forests around Lake Valencia was actually killing the lake. Those trees stopped soil erosion and moderated the temperature. Removing the trees broke the system, a system that humans depended on to live. Ecosystems form when organisms interact with each other and their environment. Now, in part to Humboldt, ecosystems are a key area of study for ecology and how they work through complex food webs such that they change over time and can be understood. Over the past 200 years, consistent measurements of the same things globally and a bridging of various disciplines have given us an understanding of how ecosystems like forests, trees, forests, lakes, and tundra all work. We now know how they change over time, and we also know what kills them. Spoiler alert, it's mostly us. Right now, research on the information environment is a lot like understanding of the physical environment before Humboldt. The information environment, if it is at all thought of today, is seen as something apart from us. It is mostly technology, or it's mostly content. We don't see how we live in it. In not understanding information ecosystems, there's a strong chance we're actually intervening in ways that backfire, much like clear-cutting forests kills the very ecosystem people hope to grow things in. Except in this instance, societies and systems like democracy are at risk. In learning how physical ecosystems are studied, we'd know, for example, that there are no silver bullet solutions. There are no singular answers to complex problems in complex systems. And in a very analogous way, we've been repeating the same mistakes from the physical world in the information ecosystems. In one, humans sprayed pesticide to eradicate pests. In another, we have tried to ban users spreading disinformation. The blunt approach isn't going so well in either ecosystem. Some cotton growers learned this in dealing with a tiny insect called an aphid that eats through their crop. The most direct solution for killing them is spraying them with pesticide. That's the silver bullet solution. It works for a bit, but aphids tend to become resilient, which increases the cost of trying to kill it. The chemicals also kill other species like birds and humans up the food chain, ultimately destabilizing the ecosystem. People worried about information pollution have tried similar blunt approaches to stop the spread of disinformation. So, for example, after the January 6th attack, several digital platforms banned Donald Trump's accounts, as well as those affiliated with QAnon and Stop the Steal. It clearly didn't eradicate beliefs that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump. He's still saying it. Quite the contrary, Trump's supporters rallied with an attack on disinformation researchers. It's been quite coordinated and brutal. And when Trump did get back in office, he's gone further to defund and investigate counter-disinformation efforts. Moreover, J.D. Vance, in his defense of Elon Musk at the Munich Security Conference, suggests that this administration will actually go attack other countries that try to curb disinformation within their information ecosystem. So it's almost like disinformation is becoming more resistant the more attempts are made to eradicate it. Now, that shouldn't be too surprising, because once disinformation is a problem in society, I'd argue it's often too late to address it, because its presence will be in the form of an idea that some portion of people now believe. So it's in their heads. Once enough people believe the disinformation, they become useful to some politicians who politicize that issue for votes. This is again why we need to step back and look past the specific problem and see the system where it exists. But here again, there's lessons from the physical environment. In realizing that the aphids are a natural part of a complex system, an alternative approach emerged in integrated pest management. The approach uses multiple interventions based on how that ecosystem works, including disrupting aphid mating with pheromone traps, planting pest-resistant varieties of cotton, and supporting natural predators like beetles and spiders. Effectively, it's about setting better conditions so that the cotton can thrive without hurting that wider ecosystem. It takes more effort, but the approach is working. It's led to a 10 to 15% increase in cotton yields and a 20 to 30% saving in pest control, to name some of the benefits. Integrated pest management is really the difference between taking a random intervention and taking a strategic approach. A random approach focuses on that single issue. That's the silver bullet to react to the immediate problem, and then it applies one option to something, whether it's pesticide to kill aphids or content moderation or media literacy to stop disinformation. Whereas the strategic approach first considers multiple factors to then prioritize a series of choices to get towards a specific aim. Then it applies several interventions working together to enact change. One approach reacts to conditions, the other tries to shape the conditions. Instead of eradicating aphids, the more strategic integrated pest management approach made the conditions less favorable for the bug. We should be doing something similar. We should be taking a strategic approach when it comes to information ecosystems. Now, just to be clear, the aphids in the information ecosystem are not the people holding dangerous views, but the ideas themselves. Instead of banning hateful beliefs, the aim should be to foster conditions that are making them less conducive to their spread and adoption by others. If we're worried about the relationship between the information environment and social stability, we need to step back and see that system, much like Humboldt did. In a physical ecosystem, we know that a plant needs certain conditions to thrive, right? Depending on the type, that plant might need sun, it might need nutrients, water, or heat to grow. People also need to be fostered if they're to perform their roles in society, much like a plant. But to foster that while also ensuring that people have agency. We can't just brainwash people into doing what we want. We need to first understand what makes a healthy information ecosystem such that people flourish. Right now, we're making a lot of guesses about what a healthy state might be based on democratic values. It feels good, but it's not very scientific. That said, I do suspect, though, that there is an answer in social cohesion. Communities that tend to rebound well from disasters, and there should be more women, but I mean, more men. I actually know, maybe we want women to lead. That was a controversial opinion. Communities that tend to rebound well from disasters have higher rates of social cohesion, which stems from social participation and engagement of members in shared pursuits. Basically, they can solve their own problems together and they have a plan in advance. I suspect a key to de-escalating information competition can be found there. Many of these concepts, though, community, network, engagement, have been borrowed by tech companies to describe their systems. But if the virtual does not connect with the physical lived experience, they do not carry the same meaning. So put another way, if a disaster or even just yet another cloud disruption takes away the ability to access a digital network and that community ceases to function as a result, they do not have the social cohesion required to have resilience. While technology might help augment existing relationships, we really need to take care that seeking solutions that depend on technology alone are really not the answer. We have to meet people where they are. It isn't enough to just communicate. We have to build bridges. That means fostering relationships in person and creating pathways to have them meaningfully participate in society. So I hope that's something you'll consider when looking for solutions, because I know that's a big part of Obvia. It's certainly enough for another book. Now, where do we go from here then, just to wrap up? First, I do think that in just realizing what we're experiencing in information competition can help provide grounding. There is such a pull to choose sides in an information competition. It's strong, it's heated, it's probably coming from people we all know. Just try to step back and determine what your own values are, independent of the information competition unfolding around you. If this isn't something that you're familiar with, Brene Brown offers an exercise on that. You can find it on her website. The second is, if you think you have the one answer to address a problem that's clearly situated in the information environment, I really beg you to just stop for a minute and put your evil genius hat on and think of all the ways in which your solution could go wrong. If there's one thing that I've learned in looking at all these ecosystems, no matter what we develop, it will be used for both good and bad. Third, please consider how your work might fit into a field like information ecology. What aspect of it are you working on? Maybe you're working on a specific process like communication, or you're working on a specific output like AI. But putting that into context can help us get to a wider field that's fit for understanding the information environment. I know not everybody's going to walk away from here today because there was a lot of information and I know it was very dry. To study information ecosystems, I hope some of you might, but I know that's not generally the case. But I hope you'll have at least a better understanding of how your work might fit into that broader field. Humboldt didn't stop at articulating physical ecosystems. He went on to correspond with hundreds of other researchers at the time across emerging fields to articulate an understanding of nature in cosmos. That gives me hope that together we can do something similar for the information environment. And of course, for anybody who wants to go a bit deeper into this, please find a report on assessing national information ecosystems, as well as the book and a forthcoming paper that I really hope sees the day of light soon, light of day. Thank you.